Okay, welcome back all. This is the closing keynote of the Danky Pawley Symposium in Print Culture History. If you're just joining us, this is the conclusion of 2 mornings of excellent papers by former recipients of the James P. Danky Fellowship administered by the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture and the Wisconsin Historical Society. The fellowships support research in the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society, vast in American periodicals and serials, and also vast in the print culture of counterculture, alternative culture, small communities, small circulations, ephemeral pieces of print, especially collected by James P. Danky during his long career as a serials librarian at the Wisconsin Historical Society. I am Jonathan Senchen. I'm a professor in the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm also the director of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture. The center is a 28-year-old research center housed in the Information School and also in collaboration with the university libraries and the Wisconsin Historical Society at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We put on a number of programs, both for people within the UW-Madison community and folks without. These include conferences every few years where we're lucky to welcome brilliant folks to campus to present their ideas on a theme related to print culture, book history, digital culture. We also have a book series at the University of Wisconsin Press. We are increasingly involved in some digital humanities projects, which you can find through our website, wiscprintdigital.org, or directly at digitalmappa.org, which is one of our great research projects that's ongoing. I'd like to express my gratitude again to Heather Waka, who is a former postdoc in the center and current administrative coordinator of the center, without whom we would not be able to keep all of the balls in the air that it takes to put on a program as wonderful as the one we've had. I also want to express my gratitude again to the 6 former fellows who gave papers these last 2 mornings that showed us how the Danky Fellowships have shaped their work in archives of print and in print culture history, but also how their work is shaping our understanding of the field. And we've had great conversations. They've been recorded and eventually will be posted to the center's digital presence if you are just joining us now and weren't able to hear these great presentations. We're also this morning joined by both Jim Danky and Christine Pawley, our benefactors who made this event possible. We've heard from Jim at earlier sessions, but I wanted to give a moment for Christine Pawley to say hello and be recognized by our attendees. Christine is Professor Emerita in the Information School and Director Emerita of the Information School during her tenure, the School of Library and Information Studies. And she is also the author of 2 terrific books in library history and print culture history, which you can find through the University of Massachusetts Press series in studies in print culture and book history. Christine, do you want to say hello?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, just hello, everybody. So glad to be here. Sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but hope to catch up with everything on the recording. So this is a great event. Thanks for organizing it, Jonathan and Heather.
Thank you. And I want to thank again Jim and Christine for their generous financial contributions, which allowed us to provide stipends to our fellows and to support their work again as it develops. This morning, you're joining us for the closing keynote address by Marija Dalbello. I'm going to stop share on the poster, Maria, so that you can put up your slides. We should be able to do that now. Marija Dalbello is a professor of information studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick in New Jersey. Her teaching and publications focus on history of the book, theory of knowledge and migration. She published on digital mediation, text media relations, epistemology of offenses, and immigrant literacies. She has co-edited several collections, including Visible Writings, Cultures, Forms, and Readings, that was from 2011, with Mary Shaw, and with Mary Shaw, A History of Modern Librarianship, Constructing the Heritage of Western Cultures, 2015, with Wayne Wiegand and Pamela Spence Richards, a special issue of Information Research on Archaeology and Information Research, co-edited with Isto Huvila, Ikiel Faniel, Kostas Dallas, and Michael Olson in 2019. She's currently editing Reading Home Cultures Through Books with Kirsti Salmi Niklander, forthcoming from Rutledge in 2021, and Global Voices from the Women's Building Library, a case book in close and distant reading with Sarah Wadsworth. She is a highly commended winner of the 2012 Emerald Literati Award for the article A Genealogy of Digital Humanities, which is really a useful and stunning piece of research that I found quite helpful from the Journal of Documentation. And she also chairs the board of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. We are very fortunate and grateful that Marija is joining us. I also learned from her when she very generously came to a talk that I gave and introduced herself that she was essentially the center's first fellow, closer to the moment of its founding as Jim, Danky, Carl Kasel, and Wayne Wiegand were leading the center in its first decade, and while Christine Pawley was finishing her doctoral degree and still within the center's orbit before returning as faculty member and director. Again, if you're just joining us for the first time, there are two methods for asking a question. There'll be time for Q&A after the talk. You can put questions in the chat, or you can also use the more formal Q&A feature. If you have a question early on that you want to save, it's better to use the Q&A feature because it's easier to find, although we will do our best to find questions whether they're posted in the chat or the Q&A. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Marija Dalbello for her keynote, Cultures Within Cultures of the Book, Histories of the Book in a Diverse America.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. How is the sound?
Perfect.
Okay. So it is with great honor and delight that to speak at a symposium named for Jim Danky and Christine Pawley. Thank you, Christine and Jim, for sponsoring the symposium, and to Jonathan and Heather for organizing and coordinating it. And all colleagues and friends who made returning to Madison, even in this pandemic mode, very special. After attending a symposium organized by Wayne Wiegand and Jim Danky on print culture in a diverse America in May 1995, my first conference in North America when I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto, my path regularly converged with colleagues from the Madison School of Book History. The wording of the invitation to keynote today that Jonathan just mentioned referenced my visiting assistant professor year at SLIS in 1999-2000 in these words, since you're essentially the center's first fellow during your postdoc time with Wayne and Jim. How generous. And indeed, that immersive year helped shape my career and affirmed my identity as a historian of the book reading and publishing, and seeing this great work by colleagues already there. This has been, and I even curated a digital project with a group of students that is still hosted at Max Kade Institute in Madison. And this has been really a career-long relationship. And I will reflect on how that connection informed my research, and how it can possibly connect to the Danky Pawley Fellowship Program, which I see so many connections after hearing the colleagues, junior scholars, many of them, how this kind of work can be continued. The title of my talk points to nested and manifold cultures of the book that I will explore in the context of ethnic and immigrant histories of the book, cultures within cultures of the book, implying hiddenness, contrasting of core and peripheral perspectives. The current efforts for decolonizing book history are bound to reinvigorate comparative transnational perspectives and place new emphasis on hybridity and cultural translation. My earliest scholarship focused on the diaspora Croatian almanacs as a genre of a print culture. At the time when book history was an emergent field. My current projects take a multi-sited approach today, combining archival and corpora-based research, applying close and distant reading, bibliographical archaeology, new materialism, and the affective sensorial ethnography. Especially in the past couple of years, I have been focused on the Great Migration from Europe to America a century ago, and I have been using open data archives of pre-elicited oral histories to study cultures of the book and literacy within the experience of migration from within that phenomenology, I would say, applying historical ethnography and a transnational comparative lens to understand the immigrant sensorium within a particular historical media ecology. Nancy Fauner's recent work, in which she draws historical parallels between the different waves of settlement in America as a lens for understanding contemporary US immigration, also brought forth the importance of post-memory reframing and studying this historical migration while questioning generational understandings and the production of conventional historical narratives surrounding migration, largely white European. Immigrant book cultures reside in the peripheries of national traditions in the countries of origin, or as minority cultures in the ethnic mosaics of the receiving countries, fitting into nostalgic tropes such as the nation of immigrants or some other ideological model for integration, such as the melting pot fiction. But cultures are invisible. These cultures are invisible under the radar and peripheral. The forms of ethnic media are expressions of material and symbolic practices, documenting identity work in a community, their memory system. Yet they are so discrete. Are they so discrete and bounded, just niche cultures? What are the lines of connection? How do they fit within the book history field? And I will start first with how do they fit in the book history field, being a book historian. I will start with that last question. One would expect that the studies of immigrant book culture would find a natural home in the field of book history and its flagship journal. And I searched by keyword immigrant in book history, just over 2 decades of its issue, and retrieved 18 essays. These references focus collectively on immigrants in the context of colonial migration, slavery, and colonial networks of importation of books, reprints, translations, reception of specific reading materials. For example, Eva Hemungsvirten mentions reprints and literary translations for United States immigrant groups in the 1990s. We find immigrants among other culpable victims in Barbara Hochman's article, or in reference to 20th century pulp magazine readers with somewhat ironic, I would say, wording of among the unwashed immigrant masses in the article by Aaron Smith. Another study of literary marketplace and transgressive reading locates immigrants reading novels as social gospel, referred to as violent immigrant workers. In these curated quotes, immigrants are working class readers, male. Their hypervisibility is relationally constructed as negative within the larger interest in cultural authority that book historians have. Specific named groups in this corpus focus on Scottish print culture of 19th century New Zealand by David Finkelstein, or feature Norwegian immigrant Valborg Hoth, which Christine will be familiar with, and the Norwegian newspaper Morgenbladet. Christine mentions a second generation reader whose father was a Norwegian immigrant and leader of the local Lutheran community in her study of actual readers and specific reading communities. A dearth of studies on immigrant book culture in this archive, quote unquote, of book history scholarship points to its peripheral, if even existent status. It would appear that the interdiscipline of book history considers immigrant book culture as a backdrop or in a transgressive or contrary context in societies in which reading practices are defined by the mainstream canons of literature, literacy, reading, and publishing. Immigrants are an undifferentiated mass in the cultural blend of working class readers. Exceptional individuals of ethnic background straddle the boundary between core and peripheral book cultures. Is being an immigrant invisible category for book historians, or do these studies exist only in niche venues and monographs? Are the studies of immigrant literacy relegated to substance systems within ethnic press, an own system of scholarship, or maybe we can even say heritage work practiced by book historians in heritage project of studying ethnic media? This has been my big question ever since I decided to study maybe a niche topic on purpose of Croatian diaspora almanacs. The national histories of the book, conceived and published throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, were a key effort in the field of book history internationally. Ranging from topical volumes to monumental series, they epitomize a systematic approach to area histories of the book. The 3 volumes of History of the Book in Canada are exemplary of that trend. And given that history of migration shaped Canada demographically and culturally throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, I probed those volumes just to see what is my sample going to tell me for the constructions of immigrant book cultures. Essays devoted to ethnic press, it included Paul Hjartardsson's government policy and allophone cultures, including references to allophone print culture of the Ruthenians, of Manitoba and Northern European immigrant communities. Other studies of immigrant book culture addressed established groups that I would expect, in several cursory references to Doukhobors and Galicians in the prairies, the Jewish community in Quebec, and an essay on Icelandic printing. All of those are relevant, and in some cases, maybe quaint histories focusing on established ethnic communities. National book history projects can certainly not be faulted for not being entirely comprehensive in piecing together an entire ethnic mosaic through the lens of ethnic publishing. But clearly there are some silences in this history of ethnic press. Immigrant book culture is an underdeveloped field, if we may judge by this like imperfect methodology. Residing within multiple centers and peripheries are immigrant ethnic diaspora and emigre press. And I'll next present a theoretical framework that helped me think about how possibly we could recognize the episodes and situate these studies if we were to answer the second question of how can we understand immigrant experience across the different groups. Next, I present this theoretical framework for integrating the particular immigrant book cultures within an incorporating conceptualization of the communities of discourse, and give a few strategies of how such approaches could identify empirical context for research. I then present my most recent research using historical ethnography and media ecologies approaches as a possible methodology. The immigrant book culture is neither entirely new nor an inertial form of culture. It is a type of meddling remix of culture innovation characterized by recirculation and selection from within a metacultural repertoire. A sociologist of religion, Robert Wuthnow, introduced the concept of communities of discourse to explain the cultural change underlying the historical phenomena of Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the rise of Marxist socialism. These three episodes of cultural production each have challenged status quo in the development of modern societies. He focused on cultural innovation that characterized these periods. The relationship between tradition and cultural change was complex, but, quote, one dimension of these periods of change was a sheer increase in the overall volume of books, pamphlets, sermons, political tracts, and other formalized forms of cultural production. It is thus important to ask at some level, without much regard for the actual content of these artifacts, what conditions facilitated these increases in productivity, end of quote. Well, he does tie them to the expansion in various forms of political patronage and by changes within the state that restrained the hand of censors. So it's connected to censorship and that restricted the voice of established cultural authorities. When this was relaxed, there is this proliferation and competing schools of thought. Instead of thematizing the changes rooted in localized and regional variations in the institutional context from which they emerge, or contexts selected for certain genres, you know, my first question was those almanacs, and I was very fascinated, and to point to conditions in which diversity itself was able to develop. And I think we have seen some of these questions answered in some of the empirical studies we heard over these 2 days. Book historians focusing on immigrant communities are also dealing with the context of cultural production, a boom in the absence of cultural censors, immigrants are free to some degree, or uncertainty as to their influence within the condition of immigration. Diaspora communities are often inventive and restricted in the resources they have and highly divergent within each ethnic group. Any historian of ethnicity, specific ethnicity could tell you that. Immigrant books are to some degree occasioned by the new conditions while they recirculate localized variants from multiple origins engaged in nomadic placemaking. They capture a wide-ranging scope of ideologies and commitments. The immigrant cultures of the book are at the peripheries of multiple centers, while also reflecting their own singular nature, if nothing else by language or mixing English and their language. My own research on Croatian diaspora almanacs over a century, from 1893 to 91, when Croatia became independent, emotional moment, articulated a culture in transition and offered a time capsule and an archive for a century of migration that occurred from different political units, fragmented in terms of political and national ideologies. A single or unitary framework model of culture would not capture the entire range of communities' symbolic repertoire or forms they used, or either political, religious variety, regional variants. So my study then used a cultural analysis approach relying on communities of discourse. It applied a bibliographic and archaeological method and interpreted publishing and survival as a social fact. Why these archives are being recirculated and curated. It was most difficult to find them actually in my study. It demonstrated through microhistory, focusing on a single publication genre, the almanac, the image of a memory system for Croatian diaspora community in a long durée across the migration cohorts, generations, agnostic to politics as well, and linguistic forms and local variants, articulations that were metacultural and predictable. And they cooperated quite a bit across divergent politics. That was very interesting. The genre of print characterized by idiosyncratic presentation, look, purpose, or appearance in a particular time helps situate a community of discourse within a number of overlapping discourse, a contentless structure that identified a community across the spectrum of political views and migration cohorts. The communities of discourse approach can be applied to material realizations of immigrant media within a single community or across immigrant groups in a particular period. For example, the communities of discourse and this conceptualization can offer a more integrated approach to studying labor movements across the immigrant communities in North America, especially when these resulted in the proliferation of media. The case of IWW, ethnic newspapers, and the radical press of the early 20th century coincided with what is known as the Great Migration from Europe to America in the early 20th century and had a strong internationalist component. But also ethnic. It is part of a second wave frontier history of North America, and recognizing such episodes and events of cultural innovation that resulted in the production and consumption of media offers manifold views of some unity in diversity as episode that can reframe the usual historical narratives and myths about the role of immigrants in labor movements. Because they are unique as well as common. How immigrant groups shared resources in their common places of settlements and even shared their politics has been a very long-term question for me and interest, and only now I think I found a group of people I can do this together with. The media space created by the so-called radical press is an excellent context to study internationalist dimensions of immigrant history. Contrast this to mainstream capitalist press, they reflect the concerns of immigrant labor and social movements of the early 20th century. For example, the IWW publications and wobbly papers especially show where in languages other than English, and here is my archive or rather the image of that possibility. So you can see here, I've highlighted 3 languages. They were mostly languages other than English, and you can also see the edition sizes, which are quite impressive. They document a close connection of the transnational immigrant press with counterculturalism, labor history, revolutionary movements of the early 20th century, militancy, and the role of religion, interestingly, in shaping pre-1919 left-wing labor movements. Multilingual newspapers emanating from the IWW networks will also lead to migrant communities among them and tell the North American and the European side of the story of the Wobblies media. I have to give a shout out to my colleagues in Finland and Canada, Kirsti Salmi-Niklander particularly, and we have a project that we want to situate in 3 sites of Croatian, Finnish, and Italian immigrant press within IWW movement. Because IWW journalism emanated from scissors and paste journalism, and here is a printing office that also refers to multiple outsourced venues for foreign language publications that are very, very popular. But it still is overlapping with agitation, storytelling, rumor, street speaking, singing, and other IWW promotional tactics for the construction of events and facts in the public sphere. One can see an unbroken cycle of consumption and production of the early 20th century prosumers who were both readers and participants in the production as contributors to the radical press, often amateurs, drawing on their literacy habits and experience. And Wobblies media, and it's completely interesting to me, allows studying print culture from the perspective of media and production and connection with vibrant musical and oral culture that draws multiple corpora together. So I'm just having a few of these visuals here. And this wheel based of multiple of the organization. So they use mnemonics and visuals, and that is quite interesting to me. My second example concerns multicultural book publishers as a model of ethnic publishing and formula publishing catering to multiple communities, exemplifying the ethnic formula publishing in Canada, which is a place I know best through some of my research, is early research, is the case of a Czech immigrant, Frank Dojacek, a publisher of several ethnic newspapers, and that included Croatian, Czech, Ukrainian Peasant Party, and farming publications in Winnipeg from the 20s through the 50s, actually even later through inheritance when he died. And this is a reconstruction of his book shop, post-memory site, I would say. The titles of the almanacs he published for Canadian farmers from these various groups shared many paratextual and epitextual features, clearly a formula publishing, the placement of advertisement, layout, design, and format almost identical. The case is, but he had the typographic tools to do that, the Cyrillic, the church, you know, all these weird diacritics. This is a case of example of model publishing that can be found across different periods. I would say this is hardly there are many examples of this kind of collaboration in which groups cooperate on limited resources. I'm aware that all of this does not address the black and white line of diversity and the manifolds of diversity, and that focusing on immigrant press and ethnicities that came out of the second wave of the settlements during the Great Migration from Europe to America is just one story, and white immigration story for a large degree, replicating possibly the myth of a white nation of immigrants. But my hope is to offer a restorative narrative in rereading this myth of migration and recover histories within and across communities within a shared site of marginality, peripherality, peripherality and invisibility. Therefore, the cultures within cultures of the book in a diverse America tied to migration are still, I can say they're still largely unexplored. From that lateral perspective, even if we are dealing with post-memory archives and interpretations, which is also a very important point I want to make today. In the next section, I will present a project that I have been intensely involved with in the past 2 years, working with corpus analysis and looking at the immigrant sensorium. I have published, I have a publication co-authored with Catherine McGowan that focuses on the methodology of on methodology primarily, working with the corpus, but also historical ethnography, using memory narrations and applying sensorial affective experience ethnography basically to understanding oral history archives. What I present next draws on the same methodologies, but this is a project I'm working on solo. Drawing across the archives of migration, and this is one of the turn of the century statistical diagrams that emphasizes visually my point. So I'm looking at the Great Migration at the start of the 20th century, and I focused on Central and Southern Europeans because they offer a coherent dimension. The groups with the highest emigration rates during this period, you can see Italians first, this male figure, and followed by Austria-Hungary. And within that empire, I find also Croatians. Using oral histories from the Ellis Island Oral History Project, Rather than focusing on forms of discourse, I considered media ecologies, representations and mention of literacy objects, and references to literacy, writing, reading, and paperwork in the context of immigrants cited within immigrants' experience as reported in their life narratives. Reading those across the interviews offered an immersive image of literacy and media consumption across different groups of immigrants, and I look at them as not documentary source much, but how they frame these images of literacy, the book, and their own participation. Much on the countries of origin and migration wave and cohort brought forth a selection from under 300 interviews from that open data archives, 7 oral histories from the Austria-Hungary group and 7 from the Italy group, with transcripts were life histories of individuals who were 10 years or older at the time of immigration. And these are life histories. They are interviewed at a later time in their lives. So I included also an audio interview with an interviewee from Croatia who was 6 years old. So it's like a little different, but in modality, because it's not transcribed. The archives represent a structured corpus because they were collected through an interview guide by trained staff, National Park Service, and a guide does not include prompts on reading or literacy at all, except in the opening section, the start, and the old country. And you can see these kinds of questions that were asked. I will not read them for you. The interviews were coded on dimensions of media ecologies relevant to the creation and consumption of media forms. And here are some of my findings. This is one interview, the one that was not transcribed, but you can see some of the metadata, and they all have similar core record. So Marija Dalbello, prompted by, she came from Croatia, she was 6 years old. We learn about how her passage, and when she was interviewed, so she was quite old at that time. And I wrote about her already in that other article as part of microhistory on sonic dimension of her interview. Prompted by the interviewer's question about how coming to America changed her life and what makes her feel satisfied about what she has done, Marija Dalbello from Rijeka has the following response. And you can probably just read the highlighted part. And she refers to a book. I would have liked to have written a little book, you know, just my own experiences. The book strategically offers concreteness to her lived experience, her full life, recorded to preserve that memory, to make the situations that are fleeting specific, because, quote unquote, you find these little books, she refers to memoirs, then immediately distances herself, but I never got to write it. I don't think I'm very good for that. Was that her desire to preserve narrative coherence of her story, you know, just like anything you would say, against the intrusive interviewing techniques of the field worker. And I will not go into that problem, but this has been so clear, that this, like the aggression of, you know, eliciting life histories, and now they cut people off and what they tried them to be. Similarly, I mean, we're still grateful for all that wonderful work. Maybe we will do the same because it is part of a conversation, and domination maybe in that, but I'll go to that question later. So similarly, Annie Turner uses a book metaphor at the end of her interview when she says, "My life is like a book I read," to indicate plot-like structure, a cue or a sequence that conforms to a set story and awaits explication. Working through our fieldworkers' heckles and interferences, at the point when she attempts, the fieldworker, cut off the interview, Annie Turner summarizes her life using the image of a book. Here, a book metaphor gestures towards expressive writing, but one may see it as an ontograph, and I use Ian Bogo's term there, welled up when situations are concretized and enumerated. An ontograph draws attention to the need for understanding and explication or way to develop the rhetorical relation between the metonymic, which is what life is, and metaphoric description. Today, one would use a film analogy with individual shots needed for continuity editing being cut together in a linear flow of uninterrupted action. Ian Bogost notes that lists of objects without explication can do the philosophical work of drawing our attention towards them with greater attentiveness. And this is what these two people are doing. The references to ethnic press and newspapers. So these are my initial quotes. So references to ethnic press, newspapers, word of mouth, penmanship, literacy, reading and writing, learning English, letter writing, remittances, paperwork, as well as technologies of inscription such as typewriters, bookkeeping machines, telephones or films appear in other interviews. All those inscriptive media aided the intelligibility of the receiving society for these narrators, their life, or maintaining connection with their families overseas. They're referencing the experienced and remembered media ecologies in the context of their everyday life. And I highlighted those that I could focus on here, but many are extremely fascinating and rich. For example, the advertisements in Yiddish and English language newspapers that Louis Israel Nash relied on in describing a world with succession of jobs and professions he held in months following his arrival. It takes energy just to read them, how many jobs he changed and what he did. But it was really interesting. So we have reading newspapers, we have selling newspapers, we have looking for ethnic press out of context here makes no sense. Actually, these immigrants really operated within the ecologies of multiple literacies, which we probably know, but this is actually presented here in these live histories. And then I had some very unusual finds. And in this interview, I found she refers to books and bookmaking, quote unquote, we could say. It's a book story, definitely, referring to an assembled book object, a reference to religiosity and bricolage involving books and images. So they had this church tree in the middle of timberland, as she calls it. We ended up from a little town into a lot of forests and woods everywhere. So I don't know. So they came with some of their books, and the kids cut out and they made this like a religious shrine for their book. Is this messy, chaotic? Is it circulation? Is it creation? And I would say, I was remembering also when Derek was talking about bulkhead, how, you know, these are the strategies that are the kids' counter publics for, they were tearing up books as well. So this remains to be explored. But there are some singular dimensions of immigrant book stories and book culture, studying their specific media ecologies and reading experience. Stories are attached to specific episodes and narratives. They are meant to be points of emphasis, punctum, to borrow from Roland Barthes, from his visual references. And I'm not taking them here as primarily documented, but creating a world narratively. So this is for Austria-Hungary and Austria-Hungary. And initial quotes for Italy, that was actually really a very interesting find by comparison. So those that overlap are highlighted here in black to Central European. So they only overlap on some. There are references to literacy, but no book cultures in the narrow sense. There are no book metaphors or book stories here. Documents and paperwork, letters, money letters, sending money for passage, and multiple references to sound, music, spoken word, Italian being spoken. The conversations about neighborhood feasts and festivals and participation are sonic, and singing, musical instruments, engagement, and even references to school. This was really one of the church tree in the Italian corpus, a curious musical object is mentioned when school question came up. The campanule singer, and this is a kind of radio recording system that the teacher brought to class. So it also landed in with a music teacher. By this first impression of the analysis, and this would be the regular, where your sisters, where did they go to school? Oh, your mother was illiterate. You know, that's what I thought. You know, so I don't want to make fun of this, but it's really like predictive. And then the other. The other literacy from above enters these interviews in interesting ways. Here, Lucy Negro refers to, so they're like, how did I get the documents? How did I get documents for my store? You know, who helped me get my, you know, to manage the literacy of the state. And here it's an interesting example that includes establishing or asserting citizenship. That's where literacy usually comes up. And here, interacting with authorities, this person, she delivered the letter she wrote. That's like a especially powerful moment for her. She describes delivering this letter to a senator that she wrote. Even getting passport, and I'm like, there is a like sonic hearing orality dimension there. In this other interview is narrated by association to sound and hearing. You see that statue over there in Italian, of course. I say, yeah, that's the Statue of Liberty. Do you hear? Free liberty. So it is, you know, kind of interesting and difficult not to notice that association of passport. You'll get a passport in the land of the free, you know, which has been somewhat changed in our recent, in our current connections. Another interviewee recalls a story of misreading an official postcard informing the family of their son's wounding in World War I. They thought he lost the whole hand, but actually it turns out to be an interesting example of illiteracy being narrated, told in the comedy of error style. They have no respect for you know, it is really a light-hearted approach. The inability to engage with literacy surfaces often in these interviews, such as in this case of the misread postcard. Literacy, so they thought the son was wounded, but then he recalls that story, how they didn't understand, couldn't read the postcard from the government. Literacy is relational and instrumental, a means of engaging the state, managing relationships to the state and the authorities. The media ecology in this group of interviews, and quite consistently across the corpus, does not explicitly point to ethnic media, newspapers, or spontaneous writing in the context of ordinary life or leisure. Those would be most exceptional cases. And I was really, these are not unusual. There is a pattern there. And this is not like giving you just unusual examples of the church tree or this campagnola, but quite a consistent, you know, like picture. I was just making a picture here of my ecology. By comparison, spoken communication and recalling immersions in feasts, festivals, and singing, as well as participation in various ethnic organizations or community associations is common. And that is also very, very significant. While it may be argued that literacy events are exclusively tied to inscription and reading, these mediations of orality and literacy, image, text, sound, in the performances of identity are historical transmedia, a complex ambiental media ecology defining a sensorium. In the interviews, there is a certain reflexivity in which speakers index difference and social distance through spoken Italian, such as making a joke in Italian that the interviewer cannot understand, and even engaging a family member who would accompany them in a private conversation, you know, exemplified also double checking the interviewer's language proficiency. You do not speak Italian, right? Or when trying to remember how to say something in English. So that is a really interesting pattern. These pauses and silences are ponderous moments of the collapse of language as a medium of translation on one hand, creating moments of confusion, I would say, on the other, by the interviewee, sorry, or even instances of intentional discomforting of the interviewer. One-upmanship when the interviewee takes charge are tactical. The competitive language game, characteristic of conversation, orality, storytelling, belongs to a media ecology and immigrant book culture, broadly conceived. If oral narration and these memories may be considered book-like forms, if we go with Marija and Dalbello and I think it was Annie Turner. So, so this was very, very interesting. And in this analysis, I wanted, just little points of this larger project. I wanted to show how the oral history archives of migration, drawing on Ellis Island oral history, can be used to study media ecologies, almost even against the grain. I was going continuously against the grain of interviewers and the state, like National Park Service, as well-meaning and wonderful as these are. This analysis has shown that comparative work offers yet another dimension of access to inter-community comparison within a consistent migration cohort in the context of their life histories. Its other dimension are modalities of literacy that these autobiographical narratives and formulations of such events may draw as a vivid pictures of singular experiences and group portraits in practices of communities. So these are group portraits, I would say, these very specific cohort central. They're often referred to as the illiterate. And I would say this, not statistically, but this does not, it is not telling the whole story, really. The figures of common readers that cannot be found in some histories of the book, in which immigrants are found with other common, this image of common reader, working class reader, or exceptional intensive readers or individuals, scholarly readers, are found here. It's like one other way to look at it. Immigrants in these life histories are inventing their own constructions around books, reading, offering portraits that engage their entire physical environment. And that's why I use media ecology as, I think, more appropriate. Even if fragmented rather than systematic constructions, these non-literary readers draw accurate reflections, just like the readers studied by Stephen Colclough in his brilliant book focusing on readers in the context of actual life, pointing to favorable and unfavorable conditions in which their experience took place. The sensory dimensions are singular, but across the sites in which reading and consumption or production of literacy occurs, across and within a broader media ecology, because it is very important to look at this historically, and that's why I limited to certain periods in the context of migration experience and overlapping with media ecology. So there has to be systematic and selected entry point in the archive. As it always is, isn't it? A conundrum facing the historians of immigrant book culture is about the making of history from the singular events, as always, and using the archives in that process. The experience of, so I don't know how I'm doing with the time, but I'm almost at the end. The experience of migration is defined by multiple centers. It is a sort of borderlands, a fractured space that needs to be normalized. We have seen that the significance of peripheral in that context being core periphery and being useful as in embracing the minor and becoming minor, by contrast to dominant and major, recognize the unique scholarly potential. I don't have to say that in this group of people, I think, but I want to emphasize that as we find the episodes of commonality in diversity, and the book creation and consumption as consumption of unique, consumption of and creation of unique media forms. Intensification of the culture in the peripheries is another dimension of core periphery, and it's interesting. And in this case as well, following from the idea that immigrant book culture is peripheral, while at the same time it is at the center, or like at the peripheries of multiple centers within the peripheries, and that we can place these peripheries in the center and see something else, which is what I'm trying to do today. And it has been borne out in colonial studies, and colonial studies often start from the archives. So we consistently observe intensification of practices and other dimensions in peripheries in colonial reading. Lydia Wevers and other, I said to myself, I will not mention names because it's like really wonderful works by there's wonderful work by colleagues. I could, this resonates for me when I'm saying this. Like colonial reading, the immigrant media forms and individuals' agency and cultural creativity are being reflected. It is challenging to address the cultures within cultures of the book comparatively. It is very joyful. I have been grappling with how to interpret immigrant and ethnic book cultures as a common historical experience, and outside of specific heritage projects, focusing on ethnic media particularly. These are both necessary. Immigrant book cultures and literacy of the second wave frontier history of North America remains to be interpreted within a multinational perspective that emphasizes comparative and multi-sited research of the immigrant print culture within their migration experience and media ecologies, and within other cultures of the book. So I would like to end on a very pragmatic note, and I think it really resonates with some of the questions and discussions we had, and this is about the archive. This work depends on rich collections, bibliographic and finding aids, and archival grounding. And I have a whole list of names of people who I can say I wouldn't be able to do anything without their work, collecting, but also, bibliographies and organizing. So it may come up in the discussion. We need to engage more collaborative and pedagogical. So what do we do now? I think we need to collaborate and create more collaborative and pedagogical funded project, seeking funded projects, of course, and cooperation building. Transnational and comparative projects using large-scale open access archives are open for close and distant reading, and they focus on print and oral histories, and this material is really proliferating as we speak. Now that distant reading is becoming very mainstream, we can build on those structures, techniques, and visualizations to understand the morphologies of these spaces. And we can start our discussion with this provocation, opening or affirming how we can craft new stories, the nature of the archives, the mediation of the archives. Joshua, Mia, Derek, also Kara with looking at post-memory sites, Daniel, post-memory sites and urban landscapes. Daniel, I didn't get to ask the question, but I was thinking relocation of the New Woman in the popular media and silent to sound film in the 20s. Then an advertisements as sorts of archives, networks of social networks and structured space that resides possibly in many of those publications under the radar that we are like surfacing now. So that is my keynote, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Marija, for this excellent talk. I'm so excited to begin our conversation, and I'm really inspired by the work that you've brought here and the way that it connects to our panelists, but also the way that it connects to what you called at the beginning, the Madison School of Book History, which when you sent us your ideas for this keynote, however long ago it was that we began planning, I was so struck by that framing of thinking about a distinctly Madison School of Book History. And one of the things, just to get us going, that I was thinking about during your presentation was the way in which the work that you're currently doing and that you've presented here really resonates with recent work by one of our faculty affiliates here in the center, and that's B. Venkat Mani, whose book came out a couple of years ago, recoding world literature, libraries, print culture, and Germany's pact with books. And as you were talking, as you were describing your work and the formation of a different archive that would give visibility to an immigrant sensorium or a migrant sensorium or immigrant print culture, I was thinking of Venkat's term bibliomigrancy that he develops in this book, and one of the tensions that I think arises, a productive tension that I think arises between the work that you presented here and Venkat's work is about the movement of people and the movement of books, and the way, which I think is also related to the consumption of culture, and the restriction of the movement of people, the free movement of bodies, of the willingness or the desire to for the U.S. to consume the media and cultures of others, while also restricting their liberty and their movement within the U.S. Venkat writes, bibliomigrancy is a term I use for the physical and virtual migration of books. It encompasses multiple modes of movement of literary narratives in original languages or translation. Bibliomigrancy contributes to the worlding of literature, the making of the catalog of the imaginary global bookmobile. Bibliomigrancy is thus a way of narrating the life cycle of books by factoring in cultural, historical, and political aspects that shape and inform such a life cycle. It is a mode of tracing and accounting for the diversity of circuits of communication to which books belong. It is a conduit for the processes that help us understand the consistencies as well as inconsistencies of book circulation patterns. And then, interestingly, with the work that you're doing with the Ellis Island Oral History Project, Venkat continues, bibliomigrancy might seem to imply an embrace of the written word, but I want the term to be more expansive and include multiple forms of dissemination of literature. It need not imply a teleological, linear, and evolutionary progression from orality to literacy. Thinking of the migration of literary narratives through multiple medialities, that is, their coexistence in oral, literal, and visual forms rather than the replacement of one by the other, might be the best way of circumventing the valorization of the written word. And I just love to see the confluence of this work by folks who are in the orbit of what you named the Madison School of Book History. And so I guess as an initial question, I guess could you just help me understand what exactly is the Madison School of Book History? Though I feel it and have been welcomed by it, I would love to hear how you came to that term and how you understand it operating in your work and the work of others who have been in the center's orbit.
Well, I certainly, that is a difficult question because it requires me to theorize.
Sure.
I don't know Venkat. He was a guest at the Rutgers seminar in the history of the book, and my colleague Lorraine Peru. I remember that, so we had very good time. He comes from a different, I was just like bracket this.
Sure.
On purpose, I did not include, I had this entire part of my paper that I crossed out on exiles and exit and entry and literary. I'm particularly interested in history of the book from below, in what I could, I'm very nomadic myself. We can talk about the Rutgers School of Book History. We have Leah Price here now, and we've done work across the departments. We don't have institutionalized opportunities like you had. And that is what I would say has been the strongest thing for me. So Venkat comes from comparative literature. He's a literary scholar. I would say I come, if narcissistically, I come from very different approach, and that would be linguistic and comparative Indo-European linguistics. I rarely mention that it's like showing baby pictures, but but this framed my mind. Like when I'm locked in, I always look for what's common. So it's really and Professor, I have to shout out Radoslav Katicic and Zagreb University kind of inculcate that through studies of Sanskrit, just seeing how something so far is something so close is always most interesting. Going back to the question, I would say that I've been most influenced by this from below approach. Our colleagues at the University of Helsinki, my colleague Kirsti, with whom I collaborate quite a bit, we always find like we situate. She situates her work with handwritten newspapers. I situated my work with orality literacy. I cannot believe we didn't start collaborating earlier in our lives. I don't know why that happened, but like we find so many thresholds at which narrative and non-literary world of books and literacy can be situated. Going back to, again, like via this line of thinking, Wayne Wiegand, Christine Pawley, Jim Danky were here, Louise Robbins, even Anne Lundin at the time. So for me, in my year at Madison, really opened up sort of this identity that I mentioned, because in high schools, book historians are odd and often antiquarian, projects. So to find people who are studying this from the perspective of libraries, institutions, and outside as well, this from below, rebel, radical, contrary to the status. This is what, for me, in a very folksonomic definition of Madison School of Book History meant, this validation of certain positions that can be both the center and periphery, but they are never just doing the canonical, literary, and cultural authority. So this is very, very diffuse way of describing my own experience. There is institutional presence and trace before you and with you, and with the center, with the work that Jim Danky has done in institutionally, and with Wayne, with the big voice, has brought to communities that are mostly, I don't know, sometimes are willing, they adore Wayne, but they also are challenged. So what challenges, I think that to me has, you're not seen as a rebel in that kind of book history. You're seen as a person who belongs. This is very, I'm not trying to theorize it here, but I think my, that specific and unique point of convergence would be around, these are non-literary actually, sometimes studies, or you know, how do people read, or what is library in the life of the user. So it's not librarianship, it is librarianship. It also opens up to all kinds of information, media, you know, approaches. So for me, I was very lucky to be at Rutgers because of media studies colleagues. We are a school, like complex school, and we have media studies, and I often work with the media studies students. I teach classes. So we have a very fluid high school situation as far as I see it, you know.
Yeah, no, I think I think that makes a lot of sense, and speaks to the moment of the founding of the center in the early 90s, as the Center for the History of Print Culture in Modern America, and also, as I understand it, as a kind of creation of a space outside of the heavily book-focused, heavily literary-oriented History of the Book in America project, and its orientation around early books, rare books, and especially its orientation to literary scholars, although I am one myself. But I have found so much generative context moving from the English department to an I school for my own work, thinking about book history across disciplines and outside of literature. And so I really appreciate that perspective.
Actually, I see you in your work, which I have some knowledge of, as also part of the new materialism and critical theory base. So I think this is very key in seeing different worlds, you know, from rare book and antiquarianism, or even literary scholarship. I would say high schools do have some interesting context also with the digital humanities, so-called digital humanities approaches. So it's very difficult to like put people in disciplinary boundaries with book history, I think.
We have a question from Leslie Howsam. Terrific talk. I'd be interested to hear Marija talk about book history from below in the context of such approaches as feminist bibliography, or Black bibliography, or transnational book history.
Oh, that is a very current question. Thank you, Leslie, and hi. I must say I'm not well versed in speaking about feminist bibliography or Black bibliography, but because I was very limited to day and to this particular corpus and migration. But these links are, but my hope is that some of these communities of discourse approaches could be relevant for any kind of proliferation of cultural forms that are invisible from below in the spaces within which they are invisible. So I was just thinking about the work that Kate Eichhorn is doing with the archives, zine archives and feminist zines, that collecting approaches by Jenna Friedman at the Barnard School, how much that has changed not maybe feminist bibliography, but the approaches and institutionalizing some of these approaches to the archive. I see bibliography as structure. I mean, this is a big conversation, I'm sure, that I would be like, I'm entering a room full of glass, and I'm doing it very carefully. So for me, bibliography is and this recent revival and mentioning. For a long time, bibliography was more, relegated to putting together lists. But for me, it resonates so much with the archive and the structure of the archive. And any work that is working within recognizing, you know, through digital humanities lens, which is an institutional concept. It's an, you know, helps situate diverse and multiple efforts so to look at this structurally. So you know, I'm not the right person to say anything more than this, but it's really how I see that space of structured like archives within which we look at metacultures, recirculations. So it's maybe under the bibliographic, you know, like it's more about conceptual migration or intellectual history or movement of iconographies across. It's like more material, I would say. Then for me, bibliographic always is a level of construction that is a point of publication or structuring of, you know, some version. But yeah, so that's all I have to say. I think with Black bibliography, we are dealing with actually similar problems with all the groups that have not had visibility in the institutional collecting. Many are being restoratively collected. Sometimes you find the world in you know, I'm working with Lara Elbala, who is, I'm sure, in the audience here. I saw her earlier, and she's working with interesting publication of our exiles in Paris who try to read it. Oh, I'm probably not doing, but sometimes even avant-garde newspapers or avant-garde magazines can be the archive within such worlds that have to be analyzed, made visible. So Lara is using very interesting methodologies to unpack a very limited run of magazines to understand the exiles, culture of expression. So,
yeah, if I might make a connection to work in Black bibliography or African American print culture, you know, one of the important conceptual moves there was shifting from the book to the periodical as the site of study. And I wonder if we might invite Jim Danky to comment here as well, as Jim's work in bibliography of Black periodicals, both as a collector, collection developer at a serials librarian at WHS, but then also as scholar researcher. Jim published major bibliography of research and published a major bibliography of the Black press that became a sort of backbone for research in Black print culture and now Black bibliography. So I wonder if, Jim, if you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
that kind of work and how important it's been for the field.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's an excellent point of departure to bring together a couple of things we've been talking about. It's when you move from a focus on the literary to a focus on what I usually term prosaic print, the kind of thing that everybody read when they had to find a job or negotiate a city or a new area, then you get a different group of readers who are reading they're reading across those materials to extract the information that they need. They are not necessarily also simultaneously focused on interpreting those materials. And that's really a theme that I picked up when Wayne and I were invited, and Christine Pawley's Success on a Shoestring is very good on this, that I got a phone call one day from colleagues at the American Antiquarian Society and said they were having a board meeting. And the question was, it was the board of the History of the Book in America project. And they'd heard that Wayne and I had, of course, rashly said, well, of course, we'll just write the rest of the history of the book in America after 1876. And they said, no, like that's our title, so we want to be part of that. But they invited both of us to be part of it. And I've got a chapter in volume 4 and in 5, and Wayne certainly has one in 3 and 4 too. But it was really focusing on these other readers that were that had been neglected by the focus on canonical works. And I think that for both, certainly for my own work in African American history, that that was fueled by the obvious presence of thousands and thousands of titles produced by African Americans, and it broke a number of paradigms, I'd say. Well, one of which is that it broke a geographic paradigm. It moved African Americans from publishing being an urban phenomena to being a national phenomena. It helped to make more manifest something that had always been there, and that simply the Black institutions, be they religious groups or educational groups at HBCUs and the like, that those separate institutions that had grown up because of white racism, and it's documenting those. It is allowed scholars later, but continuing, to see really this great, in this case, racial diversity, which reflects the same linguistic diversity that Marija was talking about. That I can't. One of my favorite examples is that there was a huge Hungarian population, probably still is, in Cleveland, and the newspaper there decided to translate, I don't remember the popular American author, they translate all of his 22 novels into Hungarian. And to imagine that there was an audience for that is, I think, quite stunning. But again, those kinds of works needed to be incorporated into the truly canonical A History of the Book in America.
I think finding these borderlands could be extremely productive, but it's also difficult. I could not handle Hungarian. You know, it's you always need teamwork with these kinds of projects.
Yes.
And the teamwork that talks to each other in ways that are, you know, it's very hard to organize this kind of research, I would say. I work with Kirsty and a colleague at Yale, and she's studying Greek American press, and also a number of colleagues in Finland. You know, that's where I most prefer to go for these conversations. And you know, there's an openness and closeness as well, because Finnish language is very difficult as well to understand. I understand a little bit here and there, but there is an openness to compare and not to be locked in. However, what Jim said, this is exactly why ethnic organizations, they are protecting themselves. So I think IWW case could show some more interesting ways in which they would collaborate. And in the mining accident, they would always collaborate. It doesn't matter if you're Finn or Italian or Austrians, Croatians would be, but I know them, you know, I know their names. So it's kind of interesting, these places of collaboration and finding them, maybe, you know, like sites, like this case that you brought up, Jim, as well.
Christine, without putting you on the spot, I don't know if you wanted to join the conversation or not. There, your mic's on.
A lot to pull together there. I think one of the things that we stressed in the, if you like, the Madison approach was expanding the archive beyond archives, in a way, expanding what counts as evidence in the history of print culture beyond what is collected in libraries and formally in libraries and archives. But within the institution, Jim sort of did that on his own. You know, he was a kind of expanding figure where he collected things that nobody else was collecting and saw as collectible things that nobody else was collecting. And so broke the mold, I think, of searching for evidence in particular places. So we could look for evidence in many different places. And if I could just wander on a bit, I think one of my own interests has come to see institutions which have traditionally been neglected as topics of historical research in their own right, because it's been left to the members of the institutional, but seeing institutions from the outside as places of interaction where individuals come into contact with the structures of the wider society. To seeing the role of text within institutions as sites of reading and writing of interest to print culture scholars. And these texts are often, like bibliographies, invisible to us, both as things that are authored and things that are read, partly because they've been gendered to be invisible in some cases, but partly because they're just dismissed as merely, products of the institution, whereas actually they can be, and I don't just mean bibliographies, but I mean all kinds of institutional documents, which are of course read and written and authored,
Yeah, I'm thinking of your great essay on the middle layer, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right, exactly, the middle layer. I'm just repeating myself here.
No. I'm providing that reference to all of our attendees, not saying that you have already said all this. It's great research, so I just wanted to give folks a way to get to it. Sorry for interrupting. You were continuing.
So any interruption in my flow of thought these days can, go on forever. No, just to direct our attention to that whole area, and examples of institutions emerging tremendously in Marija's talk. Here we are, Ellis Island, the Parks Department. I mean, that whole infrastructure that produced her archive that she so movingly addressed. Okay.
Thank you.
I completely agree with that, because we have to recognize these sites, and sometimes the text could be a site, sometimes it's a collection, sometimes it's an object, and sometimes it's a place as well. Yeah, so interesting.
Well, as the fortuitous ringing of the bell, it's actually it's a great literal reminder of time. We're right up against the end of our symposium. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who attended, dropped in, or stayed the entire time, for asking your questions and for learning along with us. I want to thank again all of our former Danky fellows who gave their talks earlier today and yesterday. Marija Dalbello for this great keynote, from which I've learned a lot, and I'm excited to read some of the work that has already come out or that will come out of her collaborations. Heather Waka for organizing as the center's administrative coordinator. And of course, finally, Jim and Christine for their work in organizing and sustaining the center, and also for their generosity, not only in the establishment of the Danky Fellowships endowment, but also for this special symposium through which we were able to reflect on 10 years of the Danky Fellowships. And hopefully this is something we'll get to do every now and again, and think about the way that the Danky Fellowships contribute to the work of individual scholars, but also to our understanding of print culture history. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been really lovely to be with you and spend these 2 days together. And I look forward to seeing you out in the world at SHARP conferences and our conferences here when we're able to safely gather together again. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very